everyone. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It is wonderful to be with all of you tonight for this gathering to celebrate the 10th anniversary of our initiative on Catholic social thought and public life here at Georgetown. We're gathered here in our Dahlgren Chapel of the Sacred Heart as we acknowledge the work of the initiative over this past decade, its role at Georgetown, the importance of this work here in our nation's capital. Over these 10 years, John Carr and Kim Daniels and their colleagues at the initiative have brought a vibrant vision for what an initiative focused on the intersection of Catholic social thought and public life could be. 150 gatherings, over 265,000 participants, rich dialogues with diverse perspectives, deep explorations of the most pressing social, political, and religious issues of our time. At the core of the initiative's mission is engagement, personal and collective engagement with the tradition of Catholic social thought and the resources it provides us as individuals and as members of this community and as an institution committed to the common good. This evening, to mark the 10th anniversary, we're honored to welcome back 4 leaders who have helped to shape so many of the initiative's most powerful dialogues. Cardinal Gregory, Archbishop of Washington, Sister Norma Pimentel, Professor Helen Alvarez, and our colleague here at Georgetown, E.J. Dion. Before turning this stage over to them, I have the privilege of beginning our program with a special conversation with the 2 people who have been most responsible for the work of the initiative over this past decade. John Carr, who first brought this vision to us and who launched this work at Georgetown a decade ago, and Kim Daniels, our current director, who joined the initiative a few years ago, working alongside John to help advance its mission. So John and Kim, first let me say congratulations on this milestone. We're excited to have this time with you this evening. If you give me just a little bit longer than a second, we will begin our conversation as soon as I get to my chair. So bear with me. This is just vestiges of a misspent youth, an old high school sports injury. But as soon as I get down, we'll get started. Beautiful. Thank you for your prayers. John, let's first begin with you. You, when we first met in 2013, you had an idea about what this initiative could be. And so take us back a little bit. Take us back to that a decade ago when you brought to us this idea of what an initiative on Catholic social thought might mean for this university, for this city, for our nation as we try to wrestle with the complexities of our times. Give us a sense of what was on your mind at that time.
Well, when we were putting on our mics up in your office, I looked through the door and there was a couch. And I remember sitting on that couch, and I had come with 25 years working for the Bishops' Conference. That's about an hour-long talk. And a brief time at the Harvard Institute of Politics with an idea, an untested, but I thought promising idea. And all I knew about Jesuit higher education was paying for it. And I shared with you my conviction that if you brought together the principles of Catholic social teaching, human dignity, solidarity, the priority for the poor, the common good, with the values of the Jesuits, discernment, dialogue, engagement, that offered the best way forward for a wounded church and a divided nation. But we needed more than those values. We needed new voices. We needed new leaders. We needed lay voices, women's voices, younger leaders. And we needed a new place to bring those 2 traditions together. And you took a chance on that proposal. And then we had a Jesuit pope with Franciscan values, who by his humble words and by his powerful words and his humble ways created enormous opportunities for us. So what we found out was there is a hunger for the moral vocabulary of Catholic social teaching as a positive alternative to the culture wars and the combat. There is a thirst for principled dialogue in a wounded church, in a polarized city. And there is a critical need to bring leaders together across lines, to build bridges, to advance the mission of Pope Francis and the principles of Catholic social teaching. So when we met 10 years ago, almost exactly to this day, I was very hopeful but a little scared. We couldn't imagine that we would be here 10 years later looking at a full church and thinking of all that we had done together. So many people have contributed to this, but what we have become is a respected center of dialogue at the intersection of faith and life, a leader in sharing Catholic social teaching and the message of Pope Francis, a place for young leaders to come together, particularly Latino leaders, and a vital sign of Georgetown's Catholic identity and Jesuit identity as well. So I thank you for taking a chance on that.
As you reflect back on this decade, lessons learned? What are some of the takeaways for you in 10 years of this engagement?
Well, the lessons. One lesson I learned, and some of you were probably there on the day that President Obama came to be a part of a panel on poverty. And one of the lessons I learned is if you're going to invite the President of the United States to campus, it is better to check with the president of the university before you do that. We never thought he was going to come. But when he was going to come, we shared this wonderful news. And you were enthusiastic, but some of our colleagues suggested the next time it would be better to ask first.
That's an important lesson, John. Thank you.
The things that have made a difference for us are mission, focus, and flexibility. Focus on the core, dialogue, young people, Catholic social people. Flexibility on how we do that. When COVID hit, we had never done an online dialogue. We did 60 of them, 200,000 people. We look outward, not inward, but we made an exception for the sex abuse scandal because it touched us so directly and because we thought Catholic social teaching could offer a way forward. A second lesson was dialogue, not homilies, not speeches. No one gives a speech, not the President of the United States, not a senator, not a professor. Everyone engages in conversation. And dialogue is hard these days. We don't want to come out of our tribes. We don't want our ideas challenged. Another lesson was diverse voices matter. We couldn't have more dialogues with people that look like me, just like me. So much more diverse, women, African American, Latino leaders, young leaders. And so you put together mission, dialogue, and diversity. You come up with the conviction that this is the right mission, this is the right place, Georgetown, this is the right time with the division, and we have the right leaders. You as a leader who took a chance on this, and Kim, who is the leader who's going to take us forward.
So as I think you all know, we're in the process of managing transition from the first leader of the initiative to the second leader of the initiative. And under the category, we can't make this up, on the very first panel we ever had 10 years ago, you were one of our participants, Kim. Tell us your reflections as you look back on these 10 years, and tell us what it means for you to take on this new leadership role at this time.
It was great. First of all, it's so wonderful to be here and look out at this gathering and all of these faces, because this is what we've been working for, right? This kind of conversation here, and to be in the center of this sacred space on campus and to be able to have this conversation is so wonderful. So thank you for joining us. And I think back to that very first panel, and to tell that story, I want to go a few months before to when Pope Francis was elected Pope. And I had the great good fortune to be there in St. Peter's Square at that time. And I say that it colors my reflections on what that panel was like, because it was such an important moment for our church, right? So many people from around our global church were there in St. Peter's, and I can't tell you how it was before that white smoke went up. It was joyous, it was raucous, there were people singing, the Filipina nuns singing will surprise nobody. They were sitting next to some German students. And then the white smoke went up, and people start pouring in from all over Rome. This was the place to be that night in St. Peter's Square. And it was remarkable when Pope Francis came out on that balcony. He came out, and again, cheering, joy. It was so exciting. And then he did this remarkable thing. He asked us to pray for him. And he asked us to pray in the prayers that every Catholic knows, right? The Our Father, the Hail Mary, the Glory Be. And I took from that day, that experience, something that I think was this challenge that Pope Francis has given all of us, right? That we're called to live holiness in everyday life, that we're just called to be Catholics together today. And I also learned much more about the global nature of our faith, because I saw it all around me in that square and how we stood together that day. To me, I was so excited to get the call from John to come and be on that panel, because that was something that was challenging to me, it was exciting, and I wanted to be able to talk about it. And it was a remarkable experience, and I was so excited to watch the initiative over the next years, because it has such a distinctive mission and does something that's so different, doesn't get done by anybody else. And first, it's to talk about those principles of Catholic social thought. So justice, the common good, human life and dignity, across the range of issues that are important to us as Catholics. And to do it through dialogue, right? Georgetown is such a place for this, because Georgetown is a place where we can talk about our first Jesuit Pope and know that those Jesuit principles of dialogue and of discernment and of trying to engage with the world in a confident and positive way are at the heart of what we do. Secondly, reaching out to young people. What the initiative was doing, which was so remarkable, is trying to respond to that question of how do young people engage with our faith today, right? Is the church leaving them, or are they leaving the church? How do we bring the principles of Catholic social thought, which are so essential to all of us and so essential to young people, pursuit of the common good, of justice, care for our common home, how do we put that at the center of their lives? And then finally, it was so exciting to be at a place like Georgetown, where again, we live out these principles every day through the Jesuit tradition, through our Catholic tradition, in such an exciting intellectual environment, here in our nation's capital, with this global perspective. I couldn't have asked for a better place to be. I'm so excited for this next chapter.
Sure. And as you think about this next chapter,
Yeah.
give us a sense of how you're thinking about the role that the initiative can play in this next decade, its second decade, strengths, challenges, opportunities. What has you excited about the work that you have in front of you?
Well, I think it wouldn't be, none of us would be surprised to hear about the challenges that we face today, right? And I think if we're talking about the Catholic Church, the biggest challenge we're facing is a loss of credibility. And that's for a lot of reasons. We can think of a lot of reasons to drive that. And the one I want to mention, because it's so important to remember, is the heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching tragedy, grave evil of the clergy sexual abuse crisis. And that has to be central when we talk about the loss of credibility. But another challenge, again, is young people. How do we make sure that we keep young people at the center of our faith, right? And make sure that they are our church right now? How do we make sure that everyone knows that and they can live into that? And then finally, we know the challenge of division. We see it in our church every day. We saw it today in our church. We see it in public life. And how do we respond to that division? Well, when I think about our next chapter, I think about leaning into our mission. So I think about dialogue on these principles of Catholic social thought, but I think about reflecting even better the rich diversity of our various communities here at Georgetown, here in Washington, in our global church. I think about leaning into working with young people, both doing what we do, these wonderful gatherings that we have. We just had one for our Latino Leaders program, and I see some of you out here today, and thanks for coming, at a great restaurant, El Tamarindo, where we talked about these issues, and we had a great meal, and we had great conversation, and I want to broaden and deepen those efforts. And finally, I want to really engage with the Georgetown community even deeper and more broadly. I think that bringing this message of dialogue, of Catholic social thought, and of the richness in our diversity is something that is essential to life here at Georgetown, and I'm just glad to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I turn this over to you and to our colleagues on the panel, I think on behalf of all of us, First John, to you, I want to thank you for your exceptional leadership, what you've enabled us to do here over the last decade, has made this a better university, but you are a gift to this community, also to our larger Washington community and to our church. And we can't thank you enough. And Kim, we're going to turn this over to you. You're going to guide us through the next panel. We have 4 very, very exceptional colleagues who are joining us for this. And we're truly honored to have all of you here. We welcome you, and we wish you the very best. We're going to now turn this over to our colleagues.
Thank you. Come on up and join us, everybody.
While our colleagues join us up here, we're going to add some chairs and everything. I'll just say a couple things. There's been a lot of talk about the transition, and Kim asked me what was going to be different. And I said, oh, it's going to be very different. You're going to have to raise all the money and deal with all the controversies. And I'm going to think big thoughts. And starting tomorrow, that's my plan. When we had the first dialogue in Gaston, it was Mark Shields, who we had a memorial for just last September. Come on up, guys. I'm just filling time here. You don't want this to go on.
This is fun. I want to hear more.
Actually, you're alone in that view. So it was Mark Shields, David Brooks, who sends his regards. He couldn't be here. And Lexia Kelly, our friend, and Kim Daniels. And my daughter Molly was here, and I was very impressed. I said, what'd you think? David Brooks, Mark Shields, PBS, what did you think of all that? And she said, I really like that Kim person. And I said, why? Why? And she said, Pope Francis. This was our first Francis Factor dialogue. We've had 9 of them, and this will be our 10th. Pope Francis walks and talks like Jesus. And she said, that's what I needed to hear. So with that, I turn to my colleague.
Well, I think it was really a wonderful, wonderful dialogue the first time we had that, right? And now 10 years later, we think about where we are with Pope Francis, where we are in our church. Lots has happened between now and then. And so I want to get started by asking just a quick question for everybody, and then we'll go into a longer conversation with everybody. But Cardinal Gregory, let me start with you. What do you think the most important Francis factor is 10 years in?
I think that Pope Francis has made conversation with ordinary people accessible. From his first written apostolic exhortation, he writes in a style that people can understand. They don't sound like prior Vatican documents. They are rich, but they're accessible, and he's accessible. And I think he's brought that energy with him. So he lives and he displays an approachability that I think has captured the hearts of people around the world. One image that I have, which I absolutely love, early on in his ministry, he had lunch with some of the Vatican workers. And he got his tray, and he went and filled his tray and sat down with the workers. I don't think that's happened with a lot of his predecessors. But he demonstrates that accessibility that I think wins the hearts of a lot of people. It's hard to dislike a person who likes you. It can be done.
I think that makes so much sense, and want to thank you for being here. And I want to, obviously, everybody knows that Cardinal Gregory is our Cardinal Archbishop here in Washington, D.C., and the first African American cardinal here in the United States. We want to thank you for joining us. And now I want to turn to you, Sister Norma. Yes, and thank you. And I also want you to help me welcome Sister Norma Pimentel. She is the Executive Director of Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley. She is the leader of the Humanitarian Respite Center. And she also has been praised by Pope Francis for her work with migrants. Sister Norma, what do you think about the most important Francis factor today?
Well, before I even say anything, I think it's important to thank you, John and Kim, for this initiative, for actually bringing us together such important dialogues that it's critical for us as church to do, and of course to Georgetown and President Gioia. Thank you so much for actually bringing us together. I think this is so important. And I see the message of Pope Francis is one of his presence, is one of radical love, totally someone who brings us to love, to really care, to be inclusive. And that's why he speaks about breaking all barriers, coming outward and actually moving and bringing others in, bringing those who are at the peripheries, those who are at the margins, those who have been left out because we have become a church that is so comfortable in sort of like a little bubble that kind of makes us okay, and we have left people out. And he's saying we have to be one church, and the only way to be one church is to kind of get messed up and dirty and get out there, get out there and bring everybody in. I think his message of inclusiveness, of encountering the other, is really what we all must do. And I love that message of him, and he encourages us to be better Catholics.
I love it. Thank you, Sister Norma. Let's turn now to you, Helen. Helen Alvarez is a professor at George Mason University's Scalia Law School. She's a member of the Vatican Dicastery for Laity, Family, and Life, an advisor to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops on pro-life and other matters, and a good friend. Helen, tell us what you think the most important Francis factor is after 10 years.
Sister Norma, you reminded me that I want to thank John and Kim, too. I'm getting old in the ways of the church. I have known them both for so long, really over 30 years. And the privilege of collaborating with John at the Bishops' Conference and his service to the church, and Kim, who I've known for almost 30 years. I mean, you couldn't have a more fortunate person. She walks the talk. Kim is faith and reason and kindness to her colleagues and to her friends. So you're a great person going forward. Anyway.
It's nice to have
spoken from the heart.
It's nice to have your friends on the panel.
Yeah, it is. So, you said that he walks and talks like Jesus, and that reminds me of what I wanted to say about Francis. Someone asked me what I thought about Jesus' words in the gospel generally, what's your impression of him? And I said, he's blunt and demanding. And I would say that I feel Pope Francis has that quality. I think the thing that characterizes him most for me is he does not stint on the radicality of the Good Samaritan demands. And he does this, for us as U.S. folks, as against some pretty radical materialism, individualism that we have. And when he asks for accompaniment, it's not like for an hour. He's talking about people who need a long time and require us to change our way of life. You can't live normally according to our American standards and do what he's asking us to do, right? He's talking about the elderly. And I think a friend of mine at the Little Sisters of the Poor reminds me that he has been the Pope of the elderly in a very big way. The immigrant, the poor, the unemployed, the young who are disillusioned. When he asks for accompaniment, it's in a way that demands that we change how we're being. And that sticks with me constantly about him.
I love it. Thanks, Helen. Now we're going to turn to E.J. Dion, our colleague here at Georgetown. E.J. is a columnist at the Washington Post. He's written on Pope Francis quite a bit and how he affects U.S. public life. He's also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a professor in Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy. EJ, what do you think the most important Francis factor is 10 years in?
I want to say a couple of things first. The first is what an honor it is to be on this panel. And I feel like I'm the minority on a congressional committee. There are 5 really holy people here, and I'm here to speak for everybody else. And I just feel honored to be in that group. Secondly, I've got to say about John Carr. Well, actually, what I want to say first is I love being in this church because thanks to a young man who worked at Georgetown, my wife and I got married in this church almost 32 years ago. And the dean, Judy Fader, a former dean of mine, we were outside in front of the church. She said, it must be really nice to teach at Georgetown and walk by the church you got married at all the time. And I said, it really is. And then I paused and I said, and it's a really good thing we're still married. But I have been, today is a Chicago election, so I'll put it this way. I've been a DeGioia delivery vote ever since, and I am really grateful for your leadership. And I want to thank John and Kim for the initiative. John, we all know how extraordinary John is. And this initiative is the ongoing and unfinished work of John Carr. You know, probably most people in this room know John Carr's stories, but he loves to tell the story about being on an elevator at a bishop's meeting, and a woman asks John, what do you do? I work for the bishops. She says, oh, great, what do you do for them? And he says, I work on peace and justice. And then the woman looks at him and scolds him and says, you're not doing a very good job. And so I think that we can see this initiative as John's effort to finish that job, to get that job going. And it's been a real blessing for this university and for the country because Catholic social thought has so many inner balances in it that we desperately need. And I found teaching so many students know nothing about Catholic social thought. I think it's a problem with catechesis and the like. And I think bringing this to our students, and Kim's work has been extraordinary, and we're very lucky she is letting John just now go and think big thoughts. And that goes to Pope Francis, because he is putting Catholic social thought at the center of his papacy. In fact, this initiative has done so many events in honor of Pope Francis. The coincidence is extraordinary, which makes me think that it's either providence or John found some way to pay off the Holy Spirit at that conclave, because so much of what this initiative is about Pope Francis. And there are 2 things I just want to say in closing about to actually get to answering your question. One is, at one of John's dialogues, the late Mike Gerson, who many of you know, and who was a dear, dear person. I'm a Catholic, so I'm easily made to feel guilty. Mike always made me feel guilty. I wasn't good enough. But Mike said at one of the initiative's events that Pope Francis is a troublemaker. And I think in the tradition of John Lewis, good trouble, he is a troublemaker. He challenges all of us. I just went back and looked at some of the things he said about the church. He attacked the spirit of careerism in the church, called it a form of cancer. He attacked theatrical severity and sterile pessimism and exaggerated doctrinal security. But here is my very favorite thing about Francis, and maybe we owe this to his translator, but very early in his papacy, Pope Francis condemned sourpusses. I want a pope who is against sourpusses.
I love it. I love it. The joy of the gospel, right? And that's what Pope Francis is all about. Let's go a little bit deeper and start with you, Cardinal Gregory. So you obviously are a real ally. You're an advisor of Pope Francis. You're our pastor here in Washington. How has his leadership affirmed, challenged, changed the Church of Washington? What's been his impact on lay people, on priests, on others, and on Washington in general?
Well, I think one of the things that Pope Francis has done is he's made it uncomfortable to take great comfort in any one dimension of the church's social teaching. You can't be, in this community, unaware that we are so polarized. There are so many examples of how we find it difficult to talk to each other. And he makes it possible for us to say, you know, if you really want to be a Catholic, you've got to embrace the whole church's social teaching. So you can't be comfortable, quotes unquote, with just the pro-life banner. You can't be comfortable with just the progressive social banner. You've got to have it all. And that challenges this arena. I've only been here 4 years, but it's clear that we've got to do something to allow people to speak to each other with civility, honesty, charity, and not feel that there are winners and losers.
Sure.
Because that's what polarization does. Either I win or you win. And I think Francis says, why don't we both win by understanding the breadth of our Catholic faith and approaching complex issues with a reverential deference to the truth.
That's a great way to lead into a question about the bishops on this same area, I think. You know, you've been president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And
Those are the easy days.
Those were the easy days. I can't imagine that. You know, Pope Francis has been sometimes a source of disunity. There's been disagreement. What are the ways in which he draws bishops together? What are some misunderstandings? What do you think about polarization in the U.S. Church?
At the end of this year, I will have been a bishop 40 years. And my first bishops' conference participation in was in November of '83. And, you know, I was a kid. You know, I think I just made my first Holy Communion 3 weeks before, but I was amazed at how the bishops in that era could engage in conversation and do it with a sense of dignity and respect. And then I would talk to Joe Bernardin, and he'd say, "Oh, Caro, they disagree violently." But you'd never know it because there was a respect for people. I'm afraid that in today's environment, even among the bishops, we've lost the respect for one another. Francis, he models, for me anyhow, how do you deal with people that you disagree with? You never remove their humanity. You never remove their humanity. And so, you know, with the death of Pope Benedict, you know, there was this flurry of negative comments, and some from people that the Holy Father had trusted and put in, you know, Cardinal Pell, he put him in charge. He put him on his cardinal's consultative body, and he started out by saying that George Pell started the financial reform movement. He didn't jump into what he said or wrote. He began with acknowledging that even people who may have had some serious difficulties did good work. Gosh, I wish we could get back to that.
I hear you. John?
Cardinal Gregory, there are lots of memories of these last 10 years, but 2 of them were on this place where you were with John Lewis and Jim Wallace and Marcia Chatelain. talking about racism when we needed to, and when we honored Sister Thea Bowman. So your leadership here in our church is so important to us. Sister Norma, Kim introduced you with the official Catholic Charities, Respite Center, Latare Medal, all that good stuff. The first time I saw you, I was watching a live video of Pope Francis at the U.S.-Mexican border. And he talked in Spanish, and I got, the subtitles were about half right. And it was compelling. And at the end of his talk, he said, "You, sister, come forward." And he pointed at you. And he said, "I've heard about your work. Would it be all right if I say I love you?" And he's the Pope, so I guess the answer was yes. But how's it feel to be the Pope's favorite nun? That's not my real question. The real question is, several people talked about how uncomfortable Pope Francis makes us. He makes me uncomfortable. A poor church for the poor. That's not me. That's not Georgetown a lot of the time. You live on the periphery, literally the border. You were singled out by the Pope for your love of people on the edge. How does he call us to get out of our ideology, get out of our politics, get out of our tribe, to focus on the poorest of the poor?
I always invite everybody to come and see. They need to see the families. You have to see the faces and the children and the tears and be really close so that you can understand what he's talking about. It's only then that you know what you need to do, because I think God created us in a way to care for one another, and Pope Francis knows that perfectly, and he's really inviting us to do that, that's why he's pushing us to the peripheries, because that's where they are. That's where those that are left out, that are marginalized, that really are struggling, they don't fit into the church that we've made, or the society that we've created for some. But he's saying it's for everybody, And so when you come and see, I just recently met the president, he came to El Paso, and I got a call the day before. I didn't know I was going to go, but I got a call from the White House. They said, "Sister, you're invited to meet the president on a one-on-one." I said, "I am." I said, "Okay." So I went to El Paso. The one question I told him is, "I need you to see the faces of the people that are hurting. You need to see those faces." It's so important that we do that. That's what will draw out of the love that we receive abundantly from God. That's why we receive the love of God, is to give it away. Why not to the most marginalized, the one that when you give it to them, you restore their dignity by giving them the love God is giving them through you, So I think this is how he wants us to do it.
It seems like we've lost in our church some, and in our politics, that focus on the least of these. It's how we will be measured, and we should talk more about this. You talked about that so directly, so clearly. It's really conflicted when we pull back from that and talk about policy. Immigration, asylum seekers are a source of enormous anger and division in the country. Our immigrants are demonized. Asylum folks are turned away. How do we, you're a bridge builder, how do we find enough in our principles, our experience, our compassion to devise a better way? How do you build bridges? How do you bring people together? Because we're really stuck.
I think it's all in the humanity, as Bishop said. We cannot lose our humanity in doing our jobs. I visited the detention facilities, and I've shared this many times. when I walked into the detention facility and I saw these kids crying, you know, the Border Patrol agents were looking at us praying, and the children praying with me and saying, Diosito, ayúdanos, you know, for little kids to actually be asking God, help us, get us out of here. The Border Patrol looked at us, and all of a sudden, they changed. They started to cry also. And when I walked out of there, the officer in charge told me, thank you, sister. You made us realize they're human beings. What's happening to us? Why do we lose our humanity in the process of who we want to be? We must defend that at all costs, you know, really bring out the humanity of who we are, you know. What is so wrong? I give water, literally water, to thousands, you know, when they're thirsty. Food, on a daily basis, restoring their dignity by actions that I care, that I am present to them, as the church is through me. What's wrong with doing that? Why would anybody be opposed to do that? Why would they find it so wrong and believe that it's not the right thing to do, that we must see them as invaders? If it isn't because we let our mind and our faith, I always call it, hijack. They hijacked our faith, you know, our politicians and everybody that puts all these fears in our minds. It makes us think that it is wrong to help our brothers and sisters.
Thank you very much. I love the fact that it's standing room only. I want the journalists to report that. But there actually are some seats over here, and we would not be offended if the folks standing in the back sort of made their way. I know it's not Catholic to sit up front, but there are some seats if you want to come.
Sure. And Helen, why don't we turn to you now? So Helen is a respected scholar. She's a very popular professor. She is one of the most respected leaders in the pro-life movement, and advisor to the Vatican and to bishops. I want you to build on what you talked about earlier. Let's talk about the most important elements of Pope Francis' leadership, his greatest challenges, how he's affected you personally, and how you live out your faith and see how to live out your faith today.
Well, I'll start with the short, easy one, which is it's that whole change your way of life thing. That's the biggest challenge. You know, as a person who, you know, grew up middle class, career, lawyer, lives here in the DC area, you get very caught up in your own path, your own family, your own children. And yes, you begin there, but getting beyond that and actually living sacrificially and relationally is something that I do think about and have to work on all the time. As for his challenges overall, you know, in some ways, I think he has the same challenges as any Catholic leader, but writ large because of a couple of factors right now. I mean, people think with, you know, what is occupying their stomach, their mind, their heart, is very much the world. You know, it's all swirling all around them. And to penetrate that, to think about what's invisible being greater than what's visible, or to think about Christ being at the center, or to think about even the beautiful things, our love relationships actually pointing to him. It's just, the world is, I mean, unless you're living in a very quiet place, which I don't think any of us are, maybe I'm wrong, the world is so much with us. I also think that, especially vis-a-vis the U.S., but any developed place, you know, he's competing with the myth of progress, right? You know, as Catholics, we say progress is actually learning how to love better, right? That's progress. Whereas the world's progress is the technological imperative, economism, right? Everything is explained in terms of, you know, whether the iPhone got thinner or how the economy is doing, right? And we make ourselves gods whether to rule the economy or to rule technology. And I mean, that's a Catholic leader struggle from the local to the universal. And then, of course, he has the giant ship that is the Vatican, which I know was one of the things that they especially thought that a pope of his age and strength would be taking on, and it's a giant ship, and it's still hard. Just the number of accounting systems alone. I mean, just start there. So, yeah, that would be my brief.
Serious challenges for sure. And let's take it one step further. Some of our friends are very unhappy with Pope Francis. There is a real disunity in the church right now. How deep is that? What are your thoughts on that?
So I can't speak for everybody on that at all. I can tell you, I work on family issues, right? To me, the pro-life issue is never a single issue, right? It gives you a window into questions about women's well-being, poor women, single motherhood, family life, children's well-being. And so that led me to the work I do now, which is on a lot of the different family issues. And speaking regarding people in that arena, so, the Catholic Church has always taught that familial relationships are the way we come to know God, his love, how he loves us, how we love one another. So it's part of the architecture of the faith. It's not one other little category hanging out over there separate. Catholic social teaching also goes on about the family being the center of social teaching. And if you think about that, it just makes enormous sense. The Irish bishops had this fab document called Love is for Life that said, listen, the church's teaching on sex, marriage, and parenting is just an application of the Good Samaritan charity imperative to the people you see the most. And let's face it, we'd all like to do heroic things, but the people we're confronted with most relentlessly are somewhere between here and the bathroom or the kitchen, right? And the decisions that we make to love them or not, whether sex has tomorrow or whether it's just today, whether the child is born or aborted, whether the marriage is stable, whether the child is given a way to know and be known by parents. These affect people indelibly, forever. They are Good Samaritan issues. I think there's a sense among some who work on these issues that they are not perceived to be part of the whole Good Samaritan social justice teaching, when they are. And in the United States, one of the single greatest factors between the rich and the poor, which ends up becoming a factor that marginalizes minorities, new immigrants, is family structure. And so if we don't attend to stability between, mom and dad and the kids, we're really failing at the center of social justice. And I think some folks who are working on that sometimes feel that maybe at this time we're perceived to be moralistic, rigoristic, and that the issues are not brought into the whole social justice arena, Good Samaritan style. That's the frustration. That somehow they're hanging out over here as a separate, and let's not talk about that, as opposed to, as the Cardinal says, being of a unity.
EJ, you and Mary were married here. You have been one of the progressives who talks a lot about family life and its importance and its diversity and the way in which the economy and our society ought to support families. One of the things people may not know about you is you covered the Vatican for the New York Times, another religion than the Post, but I have a whole E.J. Dionne bookshelf. E.J. has tremendous books. My favorite, Sold Out, Reclaiming Faith in Politics. They Only Look Dead. What's God got to do with the American experiment, and then your most recent one, 100 Democracy. As somebody who looks at the role of faith in public life, as a progressive, as someone with strong opinions, what do you think are the most important elements of Pope Francis' leadership, and what are the greatest challenges he faces in dealing with us? Our focus tonight is on the U.S. and Pope Francis. We're not talking about the Vatican. We're not talking about the internal struggles and stuff. What does he mean for us? So what do you think are his most important messages, and where do you think he has his greatest challenges?
I just want to say that I am struck with a trait right now that is not common to newspaper columnists, which is I feel an incredible sense of humility after hearing Sister Norma speak about what it means to encounter other human beings. And I swear if we could have about 10 million Sister Normas, we might start saving ourselves by saving each other. And I just can't thank you enough for the witness you're in the world, but also what you just did here. Yeah, I did get to cover the Vatican. It was Join the Pope and See the World back when I was on the New York Times. And I actually got a private audience, helped arrange. It was going to happen anyway because he had covered Poland for Abe Rosenthal, the old the late managing executive editor a long time ago. And as we're walking across St. Peter's Square, I tell Abe, I tell my friends in the Vatican that we have a lot in common because the Vatican and the New York Times are the only two institutions left in the world that claim infallibility. And I always like to report that Abe didn't laugh. But he didn't mind the comment. He embraced it. But I think that, just to go back to the theme of Pope Francis, I think that he forces everybody to challenge what they think. Some deep Catholic part of me thinks the job of the church is to make all of us feel guilty about something. And that, progressives have shortcomings and conservatives have shortcomings that we ought to think about. And I think on abortion, for example, where there are a lot of progressive Catholics who actually don't believe abortion should be made illegal. But I think what Francis does is force them to think about, well, what do you do? What is the responsibility? What is the responsibility to reduce the number of abortions if you're not going to make it illegal? And obviously for more conservative Christians, he challenges them on issues related to social justice, government aid to the poor. And so he forces you to think hard about how what you believe relates to church teaching and Catholic social thought. But by having, as the Cardinal said, it's always good for a Catholic to agree with his Cardinal, but I think as the Cardinal said, this consistent ethic of life, the old Cardinal Bernardin approach, is far more likely to make people challenge themselves, I think, than an effort to separate this, because you can't, I think, believe that once a child is born into this world, our social responsibility for that child is forgotten. The other thing I wanted to say about, having covered the Vatican is that we sort of tend to separate, say, the Pope Francis papacy from John Paul's papacy. And there are some real differences, and there are real differences in who each appointed and the like. But one of the things I think about John Paul's papacy, which I covered, is that we forget that a lot of the greatest achievements of John Paul can fairly be called liberal achievements. One of the most moving things I ever got to do was to cover the Pope's visit to the synagogue in Rome, and to sit there as an equal with the rabbi and give this extraordinary sermon denouncing anti-Semitism and acknowledging the long history of anti-Semitism among Catholics and Christians. I think it took a more conservative Pope to ratify Vatican II's openings to democracy and religious freedom. Vatican II altered the church in very, very important ways, even if every papal document begins as the church always taught. It was a real revolution in Catholic thought. I think Francis is building on that part of it, but challenging other aspects of where the church went in those years in ways that I think are useful. And I also appreciate the Cardinal acknowledging the difficulties inside the hierarchy these days, because it is, it's very discouraging, I think, to a lot of Catholics when they look at some of these issues, and it's very good of you and right of you to put it on the table.
EJ, in your writings, you often talk about how the right embraces religion and misuses it, often in the political arena, and you warn against progressives ignoring religion and forgetting about its impact. How does Pope Francis challenge progressives and conservatives, but most of us, I expect here, are progressives. Especially, how does he challenge progressives?
You know, you mentioned my book titles, which is all book authors. Appreciate that. Our friend Jim Wallace had a great book title after the 2004 election. I always say liberals discovered God in the exit polls of the 2004 election, but Jim's book was called Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It, which I think is a really interesting way to think about this. But I think we're at a particularly difficult time. I teach a class here called Religion, Values, and the Future of Democracy. And we had a conversation on the rise of the religious nuns, the religiously disaffiliated. And one of the polls that Dan Cox, who wrote his PhD thesis here, actually on the religious nuns, came in and talked to my students. And 43% of Americans under 40 think of themselves as religiously unaffiliated. That's unprecedented in our history. And there's a kind of push-pull effect where a lot of progressives, including especially young people, are pulling away from religion because religion has become so identified with the political right. Christianity, in particular, has become so identified with the political right, and it's turning off a whole lot of young people. The problem for progressives is there are a lot of religious people in the country. Religion in our history has been a force for progress. If you look back at the history of the civil rights movement, the role of Scripture, Martin Luther King always quoted Exodus and Amos and the New Testament and the Declaration of Independence. He was very smart about how the better parts of tradition lead us forward. And I think this turnoff from religion can then have a negative effect, because if people stop, first of all, just as a political matter, if people stop speaking to religious people or don't speak to them with respect, they're losing a whole lot of Americans. Secondly, they're not acknowledging that a whole lot of religious people, the most religious people in the country by many sociological measures, are African Americans. And lastly, they're missing an enormous chance, which Pope Francis brings home to us, to make the case for a less radically individualistic and more communitarian society, because that is so deeply embedded in the tradition and the Scripture. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, not at all. And I think it brings back, there's so much overlap there, right? A less individualistic society, more communitarian society, with what Helen was talking about too. I think that it's time now to go to questions. And as the new director, I get to adopt this John Carr line as my own. Please phrase your question. You're in the form of a question. And so we have two people with microphones on either side. Anna over here, Christian over here. Please raise your hand.
There's one in the back.
Please identify yourself and who you'd like to answer your question.
Hi, my name's Andrew. I'm a graduate student here in the McCourt School of Public Policy. And my question is for any of our esteemed minds and souls on the stage. Pope Francis last week wrote that the gospel is not an ideology. As a student of public policy, I'm perplexed of what to do with this line. If not ideology, how do we grade Catholic and even Christian policymakers? What is it that makes them a Catholic policymaker? How would we know that they're Catholic? Would we know? What about them makes them Catholic? And finally, if I would like to be a Catholic policymaker, what words should I want people to put in my obituary one day to know that I was a Catholic policymaker?
Ooh.
So
I teach at the McCourt School. Don't we have awesome students? Thank you. Thank you for that. And I'll let other people answer his really hard question.
Well, Helen, can I ask you to start with that? Nice. You're welcome.
This is what you get for having friends, right? Okay, I'm going to throw out a couple of things. One is, I think the bundle of issues in the consistent ethic work as, if you're a policymaker, right? You're a practical person. You need a list. and it has to be concrete because you're making policy. And So all of the, the main legs of Catholic social teaching, respect for life, solidarity, subsidiarity, et cetera, and all that flows from there, are over time, going to give the USCCB a lot of credit. I mean, there were a lot of very specific issues we worked on and tried to keep them together. I think one other thing is, if you are not unpopular with some leading figures in both political parties, then you have failed. I can tell you that when I would be taken along on lobbying trips, I was often, it was hard to trust us at the center of things because they didn't know if we would turn on them at some point because we were trying to keep it all together. And I remember thinking, I want to be inside. I want to be doing the thing, making that policy. But they knew that we were for our principles more than we were for whatever party was arranging that thing. So those are just a couple thoughts.
Could I just real quick? I think if you go through the last three papacies and maybe all the way back to John the 23rd. An ideology is an absolutely complete system of thought. I think the gospel and Catholic social thought actually creates an argument within boundaries. And when I think of sort of what is a kind of legitimate conservative position and what is a legitimate left or liberal, socialist, social democratic position within the framework of this tradition, and I think that you cannot be a conservative if you preach that the market unrestrained is all you need and forget about the least among us, that you have to support some kind of public provision for the poor. And you can argue about how to do it and where it's done, but I just don't think you can be a Catholic policymaker without making that central. On the other side, you cannot be a radical statist because I think the church also teaches, and the Christian tradition teaches, for goodness sake, Jesus was crucified by the state, which teaches us something, that while you can be for very robust government in a whole lot of spheres, government also has to live within its space. And I think it sets up an argument. The gospel sets up an argument among us, but we've got to be within certain boundaries. And that's kind of how I look at this question about ideology in the gospel.
I would say on your obituary, the only thing I would think would be important for you would be to say you were a man that loved. And that is the most important thing, no matter what you did, whether policy or books or whatever it was. But you did it with respect to everyone in your life.
Let's try and take one or two other questions, and then we're going to move on. Sean Callahan's up front. Anybody else want to get in before we? And then there's one back here. Let's put the two together. And Sean, welcome. Identify yourself.
Sean Callahan, Catholic Relief Services. Appreciate all the presentations. I have my question though is, in the 10 years that we've seen of Francis, has he done enough? And then number two is, if you had the opportunity right now to talk to him and recommend what he does to launch his next event, what would you say to him?
Okay. Has he done enough, and what should he do? There was one way back there.
Hi, I'm Dominic. I'm a senior undergraduate student. It's great to be with you today. Something that makes a lot of headlines is Pope Francis's remarks about loving LGBTQ people. I think this is especially pertinent to young American Catholics. How can we understand Pope Francis's sometimes confusing words in our societal context in the United States?
Okay. And there was one hand that I have to recognize up front. Hold on. You need to identify yourself.
My name is Linda, and I was captivated by Francis's visit to Africa. And I would like to know how you think that will impact the American church. We often think of ourselves as the center of the universe and our issues as the most important, but Africa is a big place, and so is South America. So I would like to hear about that.
Do you have a last name?
I do. It's
All right. Africa, LGBTQ, and what should he do?
Well, first of all, in response to the question, has he done enough? I would be bold enough to say that he would say, no, I have not done enough. And that's why he's still struggling with pushing the church forward by listening. You know, he's inviting us to listen to one another. And we're all familiar with the context of the Good Samaritan, which he uses often and it's applied. I'd like to apply another parable to Francis, the prodigal son. He is challenging the elder son to love the younger son. And that wonderful, that conflict of the elder son refusing to go into the celebration. I think Francis is talking to both sons or daughters. We could have prodigal daughters too. And he's saying, he is your brother. You have to love him. He was broken. He's come back. And I think, in reference to the church in the United States, I think that's what Francis is trying to do. He's trying to say to us, your brother has come home. Yes, he's done some crazy things, but he's still your brother, and you must love him. You must rejoice with him. In reference to the question about opening our hearts to the LGBTQ, I always get that wrong. Please forgive me, but we don't have a choice. Those people belong to us. They are our sons, our daughters, our uncles, and it's that prodigal son thing again, which we have to say to our brother, to our sister, welcome home. We were not a complete family without you.
I think that's a great way to end it. And I want to thank you all for joining us here on this 10th anniversary celebration. Before I close, I want to preview some upcoming dialogues that we have. On Monday, March 13th, we're continuing our 10th anniversary celebration of Pope Francis' election with a special dialogue with Cardinal Michael Czerny on Siblings All, Signs of the Times, and the social teaching of Pope Francis. We'll hear from Cardinal Czerny, Joan Rosenhauer, Tony Annette, and Zane Sharapova-Kabaleva on Pope Francis' leadership on global issues such as migration and refugees, human life and dignity, and war and peace, with a particular focus on Fratelli Tutti. We're also planning dialogues on responses to poverty, on work in the new economy, and on failure of immigration policy. And so please visit our website for more information about all of this. I want to thank our colleagues in mission and ministry for this wonderful space and for allowing us to be here. Special thanks to my colleagues John Carr, Kim Mazik, our new Associate Director, Anna Gordon, and Christian Sunan for their efforts to put together this 10th anniversary celebration. And before we close, we have something special. We'd like to reflect one more time on our work by showing you a video produced by our colleagues at Georgetown's Creative Services. So we'll just take a minute here.
Georgetown's initiative on Catholic social thought and public life celebrates a decade of leadership and dialogue at the intersection of faith and public life. The initiative has become a respected center of principled dialogue in a divided capital. It's become a leader in sharing the principles of Catholic social teaching and the message of Pope Francis. It's become a place for young leaders to gather and talk about their responsibilities and opportunities.
When President DeJoy invited me to Georgetown to launch this initiative on Catholic social thought and public life, we had high expectations, but no one thought we would do 150 gatherings. We'd reach 250,000 people in less than 10 years.
What we do at the initiative is bring the principles of Catholic social thought, like a commitment to justice and the common good, to national and global conversations. We have dialogues with a difference, where we bring together people from across all sorts of divides, ideological, religious, racial, other divides, to have conversations, not speeches, about major public issues. We also convene national leaders in the Catholic Church and elsewhere to come together around how do we bring these principles to public life today. And then most of all, we encourage a new generation of young Catholics to see their faith as central to their life and work.
The initiative and its dialogues are an example of Georgetown's Catholic and Jesuit mission in action.
The initiative has helped to foster a rich context for us to understand the leadership of Pope Francis and his call for dialogue and encounter, his challenge to care for creation, and his commitment to the poor and the vulnerable.
These 150 dialogues and gatherings have reached more than 260,000 people in person and online. When COVID made in-person gatherings impossible, the initiative quickly pivoted to online dialogue, broadening its reach nationally and globally and deepening its impact.
That dialogue right at the beginning of the pandemic had so many people come together and say to themselves, how do we face this? How do we think about not just ourselves, but what we're doing as a community here in Washington, here at Georgetown, nationally and globally?
From the very beginning, the initiative took a distinctive approach to promoting principled dialogue and bringing leaders and people together to build bridges that seek the common good.
The initiative is really different. No one gives a speech. President Obama came to talk about poverty. We went to the White House and said we want the president to come, but we don't want him to give a speech. We want him to be a part of a discussion. And they said presidents don't do panels. Well, this president did a panel.
If coming out of this conversation, we can have a both and conversation rather than either or conversation, then we'll be making some progress.
We have a focus on our Latino Leaders program, which brings up young Latino leaders to see their faith as an asset in their life and work.
We live in a very important city, Washington, D.C., where everything happens, political, business, religions. And I really love how the initiative and Georgetown in general try to build bridges between different religions, ideologies, and political affiliations.
We have become so polarized and have, in so many different ways, lost the ability to speak civilly to one another.
I think whether you're Catholic or not, the church plays an important role in society and particularly in politics, as it just brings so much awareness to how the church impacts policy, social life, social policy, and really helps integrate a lot of different aspects of life that are present.
The initiative invites leaders with diverse views, different backgrounds, and a variety of political and religious commitments.
If you are coming into these movements from simply the political, then you've missed the point. You've made God's message too small.
Diversity for us is not an option. It's an expression of who we are.
And in this country, because of the color of your skin, because of your sexual identity, because of your gender, there's a possibility that you will not return. And so much of our Christian teaching is about the miracle of Jesus' return and the joy that it brought. And if we could connect that idea that we just want the people we love to come back to us, then perhaps we would have a more humane approach to these questions.
Georgetown has kind of the resources to reach a lot of the key leaders that we need to listen to about a lot of these issues. It's also an environment that is open to and really conducive to a faith that does justice.
As an alum, there's a sense of pride that there's a commitment to these issues, a commitment to what it means in everyday life. And especially at a time when there seems to be so much division and people sitting on opposite sides of the aisle not willing to have conversations, the initiative is encouraging us to draw together to have these conversations.
I think there is a Catholic way, a Jesuit way, and a Georgetown way of bridging differences and lifting up moral principles that's really needed now. Pope Francis is the first Jesuit pope. Georgetown's the oldest Jesuit university in the United States. What better place to share the mission and message of Pope Francis?
And I think we lose a lot when we lose the concept that each person is made in the image of God. And if you put that at the center of your social worldview, and you could be a little more conservative as I am on economics and things, or you could be more liberal, but you'll probably be heading in the right direction.
We're so proud to be here at Georgetown. We're one piece of that great mosaic around the Georgetown community that helps lift up that Catholic and Jesuit identity and put these kinds of principles in the middle of students' conversations.
This essential work is urgently needed, and it's a vital sign of Georgetown's Catholic and Jesuit identity in action. This work is not only the product of an impressive 10 years, it is an investment in the future. The conversation has just begun at the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life.
Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's thank Cardinal Gregory, Helen Alvarez, EJ, and Sister Norma. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for being with us.